Moi. So for the past 1.5 years I have been studying Finnish while I've been living here in Finland, and from the very beginning I guess it was a bit of a challenge to learn all of these new words that are so different from my main language, which is Portuguese, and to put them all, let's say, in context relative to each other and properly learn the language. In the beginning I guess it was easier because there's not as many words that you need to keep track of and things going on in the language, and so but later I had to kind of structure things a little bit more so that I could build on top of it. And so I guess that's what this video will be about: how to develop effective self-study strategies for tackling grammar aspects. And I think grammar is a difficult topic, and for many people I guess they're more like intuitive learners. They go out there and learn by talking, by speaking with other people, and that's, I guess, is a very practical or a very valid point. But I think that grammar is still very important, especially for people who don't have that much time and need to choose very well what they do. They work, and at their workplace they speak English, and then they need to study Finnish on the side, and which is my case actually. And so grammar I think is something that you should study in like a very well structured way. You don't need to study it many times, perhaps revise it every time you need, but it's not something that you should know by heart, I guess, but it's something that you should know so that you bring more context to the new things that you learn about the language. And I'll actually give you an example of that. So when I go out with Finnish friends and they tell me a new expression or a new word, I ask them about it and how does it translate directly, what does it mean, when do you use it. But then when I arrive home I don't remember it, and usually there's like one word that I remember from the whole trip, and it's usually like a noun or a very important adjective or verb if it might be the case. And I think that happens because that knowledge, that new knowledge, doesn't have a context against which to bind into your concept knowledge about Finnish language. So in your brain you kind of need more things to reference the new pieces of information that you're getting. And of course I guess that's why language becomes easier and easier as you learn more. But so how do you start? How do you bring structure to grammar? I think that Finnish is quite a good language for this because it's so well structured. There aren't so many particular cases, irregular cases, and it becomes a quite okay language to study in a more structured way. Of course that puhekieli or spoken Finnish is still going to be quite a bit of an obstacle that you're going to have to face, but at the end of the day grammar is still the same. Even puhekieli is like the spoken form of Finnish that Finns use during the day when talking to each other, and there's a lot of slang in there, but the grammar is still the same. Small disclaimer, I'm still a beginner trying to learn, probably like you, and I'm not so well aware of all of the mistakes that I'm doing. I'm sure I'm making lots of them, so if you do find mistakes, don't judge me too harshly, I guess, and drop a comment down below on what mistake it was and what is the correct way of saying it, of writing it, whatever it was. So yeah, let's try and learn together. I guess that's the main purpose of making this video, is that we can share our different methodologies, our different difficulties, and so forth. So that said, I'm going to be presenting what I did for my own self-study of verb types. So what I did is, in Finnish there are 6 verb types, and for each one I picked 5 verbs that were most representative of the different nuances of conjugation in each case. In each type, but then also making sure that it is verbs that I'm already familiar with and that I guess every beginner will get familiar with as they read through the books and learn the contents. And so I think it's a valuable reference that covers pretty much all the verb types, and it's very useful because once you know them, every new verb that you learn, you will hopefully intuitively already be able to reference back to these verbs that you already know how to conjugate. And so before we move on, some assumptions. So I assume in these videos that you, or at least in this one and the next ones that I hope to make about actually conjugating the verbs, that you're familiar with consonant gradation and vowel harmony, and that you are okay with them. So I won't spend too much time going over what is happening in each word. In terms of resources, I for this grammar stuff, I used, at least for this video, I used two main sources. Usekielemme, which is a website that gives you some really nice grammar content. It has some limitations, I guess, in some contents, but you won't realize that until much later on in your studies, but it covers things in a structured way, which I think is the most important thing. And then I also, of course, study through Suomen Mestari book, which is a book that most beginners will start studying when they go to courses, and it's a reference book, I guess. But I don't agree with some of the methods employed. I think that grammar is very poorly explored, and there are repeating content that you are like, well, partitive, but I already learned this, why are we learning again? But now it's a new rule, but what did I learn before? And it gets a bit complicated, but anyway, it's a good reference that I think many of you will study. Okay, so here's the table of the verbs that I picked, 5 verbs per each type. And starting with verb type 1, so these are verbs that end in vowel followed by an A. So capital V stands for vowel here. And so A can be either A or back or front vowel A's. And so starting with the first one, puhua, to speak. I guess it's going to be one of the first verbs that you'll learn when you're studying, because it's well, quite common, and it's given as an example of a Finnish verb. Maksa, to pay, and this is I guess, well, kind of self-explanatory. It's a day-to-day activity, and it will show up in your studies as well, even though it might not be the most common verb. Nukkua, which means to sleep. So again, this is about like day-to-day activity kind of thing. So every time you want to talk about what you did or how you slept, for instance, you'd use this verb. Asua. Asua means to live, and it's an important verb for presentation. When you're talking about yourself, where you come from, where you live right now, and so it will come up in every, I guess, exercise of interacting with a new person and a stranger, where you present yourself to them. And then juhlia. Juhlia means to celebrate or to party, and this is a bit of an uncommon verb, but I added it here because it's a bit different than the others. It ends in an I followed by an A. And like I said before, so the idea here is to pick verbs that kind of represent the different nuances of each conjugation type, so that we have a good representation of what the type is, because later on you may come across different words, maybe nouns or adjectives that have an I close to the ending, and you might be confused into thinking that they look like a verb, perhaps, I don't know. But it's unusual, and it's not so common to have an I there, so I added this verb for this reason. There are plenty more verbs of type 1 that are very common and that you can pick from if you don't like this list that I'm giving to you. Okay, so type 2. Type 2 are a very regular type of verbs that end in da or da, and their conjugation is very regular. And starting with the first one, juoda, which means to drink, and then the second one, syödä, which means to eat, so kind of conjugate of each other. And it goes in line of these day-to-day activities when you're talking about what you ate and what you drink in the morning and things like that, so it shows up in your study under this context. And then tehdä, which is a very important verb, which means to do or to make. And so when you did something in the past, or when you want to do something, you use this verb, so very, very common and important verb. Then there's nähdä, which is to see, and is the verb that is associated with this expression of nähdään, see you later, it's what it means. And I guess it's going to show up very, very early, even though when you learn the expression nähdään, you don't understand exactly that is associated with this verb, but it's a good verb to be in the list. And then myydä. Myydä, it means to sell, and it's a verb that is, I guess, not very common, but it also represents a bit of a weird case where you have these double Y's before the da. And so, for instance, when you conjugate it in the imperative form, when you say sell, when you're telling someone, directing them to sell something, you'd say myy. And then that, when it shows up written, it might be a bit confusing because it doesn't look like a verb, it's just a single syllable. And so I guess it's also a good very short verb that is good to have. Verb type 3. This is a verb type that has many different endings, and I guess it's different from others in that regard. Endings in la, double L-A, sta, also na, and ra. And this this double R-A is actually quite uncommon, as I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. So the first verb that I think is important is the verb olla, which is actually not part of the 5 verbs that are put in the list, but I guess it's like a bonus that you should learn this one. It's the most important in all languages, which is the verb to be, and it can be used well for many things, saying where you are or saying how you are in that moment. But then I also picked opiskella, which is to study, which I guess if you are studying Finnish, then you're probably going to use this verb. I picked also tulla, which means to come. And so when you want to tell someone that someone is coming, you'd use this verb. Nosta, which means to rise. It's, I guess, not a very common verb, but it represents the sta ending. And it is a verb that shows up when you're studying Suomen Mestari, and I guess you could use it to say that the sun rises, and you could also use it to say that when you rise in the morning, when you get up, but it's not like, there's another verb for saying to wake up. So you could say you wake up and then get up in the morning, but it's the one that I picked for representing this case. Then there's mennä, which is to go, which is the opposite of tulla, to come. Also very important for talking about daily stuff. And then purra. Purra is very, it means to bite, like to bite. And it is very uncommon to have verbs ending in double RA. And this is, I guess, the verb that is given as example for this case, and I added to the list for that reason. Verb type 4, this is all the verbs that end in a vowel followed by TA, but it excludes the verbs that end in ita or ITA. So this will be the next verb type 5, as we'll see in a minute. But so in this category I've chosen haluta, to want. It's a very general purpose verb that you'd use every time you want to say that you need something or that you want something. You'd want this, you'd use this verb. Herata, to wake up. This is a verb that I guess is in contrast with nosta that we saw earlier. Yeah, it means to wake up, and it's what you'd use normally when you wake up in the morning. Then there's avata, which means to open. So every time you open a door, open a window, you'd use this verb. Siivota, which means to clean. And I guess this is not a common verb, but it shows up in the studies, not quite in the beginning, but it does show up. And I think it's also an interesting case for conjugation. And lastly, there's pelata, to play, and it's the verb that you'd use if you're going to play football or some other kind of game. And it's not the same verb that you'd use for playing an instrument, so keep an eye out for that. Alright, so verb type 5, it's verbs that end in ita. So there's still a vowel there before the TA, but now the vowel is an I. So every time you have an I before the TA, it's not verb type 4, it's verb type 5. And so I won't go into the details of the differences and how do you conjugate them now. I hope to get to that in a later video. But so as a reference, I picked these 5 verbs here. Tarvita, which is to need. I guess it's an important verb. Every time you want to say you need something, you need to use this verb. Valita, to choose. Also important for day-to-day activities. And then the next 3 ones that I picked aren't so useful, I guess. There aren't too many verb types in this category. I try to pick again those that are representative of weird cases or something like that, but this is actually quite a regular verb type. So I picked merkita, which means to subscribe when you translate it literally. So if you're subscribing to the video, I believe you can use this verb. I'm not sure, so don't trust me. But merkita, it comes from merki, which is mark or check mark, and it's the action of checking or marking something. Then häiritä, which is the verb that is given as an example to this verb type in the book Suomen Mestari, and it means to disturb. So I guess it's a bit of a bonus. It's not a verb that you'd use very often. It's like if your neighbor is disturbing you by playing music loudly, you'd use this verb. And then there's mainita, to mention. It's also another weird pick, but I guess it could be still a good reference. I guess you have some freedom here to pick what you believe is most important for you. Verb type 6, these are verbs ending in eta, and they are usually associated with adjectives, so they're like a verbal form of the adjectives. And so I picked adjectives that were familiar to me from my studies and from Suomen Mestari book. and I believe that it will be familiar to you as well. So the first one is vanheta, which means to grow older, and it comes from the adjective vanha, which is old. Then we have lammeta, so don't judge me on my pronunciation, but it comes from lamin, which is warm, and so it means to become warmer. Then we have kulmeta, which comes from the adjective kulma, which is to become cold, which is, I guess, in conjugation to becoming warmer. And then we have pideta, which comes from pitka, which is long, and so, or tall, and so it means to become longer or to become taller. So I guess you could use it if your kid is growing taller. And then nuoreta, which means to become younger, so it's opposite from vanheta. And yeah, it comes from nuori, which is young, and it's an adjective as well. Alright, so I hope that with this table you get a comprehensive understanding of the different verb types and what it expects you. So there are like some 8 or 10 tenses that you need to learn about Finnish verbs, and so you'll need to learn how to conjugate all of these verbs in 10 tenses. So it's a lot of study, and you can go through them all if you want to. But I don't know if it's a beneficial thing or not. You can go through some of them, that's for sure. But at least you can reference back to these verbs that you know well and get some intuition to how conjugation happens in every single different case or nuances of each type, which is the goal. So this is, I guess, a structured way to approach the study of verbs and grammar. You take these references and then other verbs that you learn will come from this. So let me know what you think. Do you think that perhaps this table would be more useful, or how would you build your table and how do you study yourself? Do you think that this strategy is even useful? And yeah, so I tried also to do this same thing for other types of words like nouns, because Finnish has noun cases and nouns are conjugated, technically speaking, and also the same thing for adjectives, but it's not very easy because there aren't such good categories for word types as there are for verb types. Alright, so this concludes it. I think that this was quite useful for me. Let me know if it was useful for you as well. I will try to make videos next coming up on how to conjugate the verb types that I've presented and how to and how to go through each one of the verbs and the difference between them. And so video by video, I hope to be able to give this to you. And yeah, see you next time.